Perhaps everything in this world balances itself out. While some people are celebrating, others are bound to feel sorrow. Just before the Christmas break, while Hermione was over the moon about receiving the two-way mirror, Daphne pushed open the door to the Slytherin girls' dormitory looking dejected. "Did Professor Snape pick on you?" Pansy asked, eyebrow raised. "How did you know he was there? Did you sneak in too?" Daphne shot back, though she didn't answer directly. She was annoyed. Pansy had promised not to go, then apparently had gone anyway and hadn't helped her. Pansy seemed to read her thoughts and only shook her head with a wry smile. "I was reading in the dormitory," she said. But with Malfoy's cleverness, some things were always going to be pointless. "You," Daphne started, exasperated. She'd already lost the fight, and now Pansy dismissed it as meaningless. Her anger gave way to the kind of hurt that brings tears to the eyes of even the most spoiled purebloods. After all, Daphne was only a third-year witch, not yet 15. Seeing her friend on the verge of crying, Pansy put down her book, rose, and folded Daphne in a gentle hug. She patted her back and murmured in her ear, softening Daphne's anger. "I didn't want you to go in the first place," she said. "I couldn't control what you'd do, so I had to let you learn for yourself." The sudden embrace calmed Daphne's tears. "If you knew all along, why didn't you just tell me?" she asked, wiping her face. "Tell you?" Pansy released her and glanced at the desk, where an unfinished copy of the Persian Wars lay open. In 480 BC, Persia went to war with the Greeks. Greece was a patchwork of city-states, each independent. Only King Leonidas of Sparta tried to stand against them. Her eyes seemed to look through the room and back into history as she spoke. He did everything to warn the other city-states about the danger. Did they listen? Even in Sparta, only 300 of his personal guards volunteered to follow him. As Pansy told the story, the famous stand at Thermopylae slowly unfolded between them. When she finished 15 minutes later, the dormitory was quiet again. "So you deliberately let me fail so I'd follow you?" Daphne asked bluntly, shaped by her upbringing to see motives clearly. Pansy turned to her calmly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "Do you remember what I started to say before you left the dorm?" she asked. "I didn't finish it then. There was a second half." She looked at Daphne and spoke each word slowly. "Don't walk behind me. I might not be a good leader. Don't walk in front of me. I am not one to follow. Walk beside me and be my companion." Her sincerity was plain. Under Pansy's steady gaze, Daphne felt her cheeks warm. "What are you actually after?" she asked, embarrassed. "Since term started, you've been acting odd, carrying those muggle books everywhere. We're witches, not muggles." Daphne turned away from the look in Pansy's eyes, but the tone of her question had softened into concern. Pansy didn't answer directly. She only repeated Daphne's sentence under her breath. "Yes, we're witches, but also because we're witches." The rest hung between them. Time moved on. 2 days slipped by, and finally, the Christmas holidays arrived. Eno decided, as always, not to take the train. He returned to his cottage in Hogsmeade and then apparated through a fireplace to the leaky cauldron. After a few friendly words with old Tom, he ordered another batch of smuggled dragon meat. With that business done, he stepped out to a quiet stretch of road, drew his wand, and pointed it up. With the screech of brakes, a double-decker night bus materialized. Stan Shunpike popped open the door with his usual teasing flourish. "Merry Christmas, England's big shot, best-selling author and singer," he trailed off. "Stop right there or I'll turn around and leave." Eno pretended to be offended. "No, don't." Stan jumped down and fished a finely bound book, The Hidden Story, from his pocket. "If you're going to leave, at least sign this." Eno laughed and produced a marker. He'd gotten into the habit of carrying one since his books and records came out. "Can't believe you bought one," he said, signing. Stan shrugged. "By the way, when are you putting out new songs? One single feels a bit lonely." Eno thought for a moment and answered, "New songs should be out before next summer." He planned to release The Cup of Life soon as a warm-up for next year's Quidditch World Cup. Once aboard the night bus, he told Stan where he was headed. Shocktoberfest, a Halloween-themed amusement park known as England's scariest haunted house, set at Tully's Farm on the outskirts of London. The park featured more than 10 different themed haunted houses, each with carefully written backstories and full hotel and dining services. It was the perfect place to hunt for raw fear. Before the holidays, he'd tried to gather fear in the Forbidden Forest for his boggart experiments. But aside from the centaur tribe, the other magical creatures produced disappointingly little terror. Even the acromantula, famed for intelligence, reacted weakly. As for the centaurs, he didn't want to provoke humanoid beings, partly out of respect, partly to protect his own sanity. In short, the forest couldn't give him the kind of fear he needed, so the amusement park seemed the next legitimate choice. Staged terror, but intense and plentiful. The night bus threaded through London's streets, and within minutes, the urban sprawl gave way to scattered houses and stretches of trees. As the bus picked up speed into the suburbs, Eno leaned on the brass pole and thought about how the boggart's nature had revealed itself over the last 2 days. He'd discovered a remarkable use for its smoke-like aspect. Not only could it serve for reconnaissance by adopting a second perspective, it also behaved like actual smoke, able to aggregate, disperse, and fuse. A palm-sized ball of black smoke, when tightly gathered, became a dot as dark as ink. When dispersed, it spread into a faint mist that could fill half a room. The form changed the effect. The acromantula had provided the clearest feedback. When the boggart condensed into the ink dot state and touched an acromantula, the creature convulsed. In its misty state, it caused any acromantula caught inside to panic and be terrified. There was no absolute superiority between the two states. One delivered single-target convulsions, the other produced area of effect fear. Chapter 202, The Ultimate Spiritual Experience. When the night bus came to a halt by the roadside, Eno stepped off with £57 and 12 shillings in his pocket and walked confidently into the thrilling October festival. He soon discovered a fatal flaw. It was Christmas. Few people came to a horror park at Christmas. This was Disney season. Even so, as one of the British Isles' better-known scare parks, the place still carried an intense atmosphere despite its relative quiet. A broad plaza opened before him. Paths ran silent between bizarre, neon-lit facades, and grotesque houses of terror dotted the grounds. Staff and costumed figures flashed past occasionally. Even standing outside, a faint dread lingered. Following the signs, Eno passed one themed house after another. Ghost fire, skeletons, blood-stained halls, the living dead, a tunnel full of giant centipedes. He stopped in front of a building dressed up as an abandoned hospital, not because he meant to go in, but because a small convenience stall sat by the entrance. For £1, he bought snacks and an ice cream, and learned from the middle-aged owner that the park's real business was the 24 days around Halloween. It stayed open the rest of the year, technically, but with so few visitors, many attractions were canceled. Rock concerts, mud runs, paintball wars. "Eat your snacks and go back," the owner advised quietly. "They won't sell tickets to anyone under 16 unless they're with a guardian." "I'm not going in," Eno said with a smile, "just looking around." He took his ice cream to a bench opposite the stall and sat. Even alone, a faint thrill ran through him from his second perspective, a tingle of joy, as if the place were built for a boggart to thrive in. Minutes passed. He finished the ice cream and a small bag of dried cranberries as the sky dimmed. Just as he stood to leave, a cluster of voices drifted over from down the path, and he sat back down. "I remember there's a stall here. Maybe we should just go home. This place is overrated." "I came to feel fear, not watch clumsy clowns." The complaints made Eno smile. A moment later, 3 men and 2 women in their 20s, all fashionably dressed, rounded the bend. They headed for the stall, but as they passed the bench, 2 of the girls veered and came to sit. The nearer one, a blonde, dropped her bag and leaned in with perfume and a practiced grin. "Little one, visiting alone? There are ghosts here at night." Eno rolled his eyes. Her move was old-fashioned and obvious. Pressing herself against him to start a conversation was tasteless. He lowered his voice on purpose to bait the boggart. "You know about it too? The hospital house across the way. People say they've actually seen ghosts inside." "Really?" The blonde blinked, surprised that a casual line had landed. "Yes, really," Eno nodded. He shifted away from her touch, only to find the bench ended. Laughter came from behind them. "Ha ha ha, Belinda, your enthusiasm scared him. He's practically trying to bury himself in my arms." Eno stood up without a word and left the bench. The 3 boys returned from the stall at the same time. There was no malice in the exchange. After a few minutes of chat, he learned they were medical students from Cambridge, testing their nerves because they wanted to become forensic doctors. At the horror house ticket window, Eno watched them. "You sure you want to feel fear?" he asked. Belinda, the blonde, answered with exaggerated cheer. "Of course, little Eno." He nodded, wished them well, and walked away. A faint wisp of smoke drifted from his cuff and silently followed the group. Back on the bench, his second perspective opened like a panorama into the hospital set. It looked convincingly abandoned. Long corridors littered with stained medical records, walls daubed with strange graffiti, and scratches that resembled frantic fingernail marks. "This feels different," Belinda said first. The place struck her as oddly real. The dark purple scrawl on the plaster might have been dried blood, she thought. The others, circling the entrance and talking themselves into courage, began to analyze in clinical tones. Standard trick: animal blood bought legally, smeared to look authentic. Those scratches, simulated bone claws driven by hydraulics. Eno listened with a faint smile. Their professional, dispassionate breakdowns and their hesitation fed the atmosphere. What had been a small wisp of smoke expanded, spreading like breath across the entryway, growing and stretching from 1 meter to 2 meters, until the thin haze enveloped a full 20-meter radius. Eno closed his eyes and leaned back. Through the sharing, he felt a peculiar satisfaction wash over him, like studying all year and finally getting the results he'd hoped for. It was an intoxicating, almost spiritual pleasure. He let himself sink into it. Because his eyes were shut, he didn't notice the changes that began around the bench. From that spot outward, tiny pebbles lifted and hung in the air, rotating counterclockwise in a nebula-like spiral. As the rotation quickened, the local gravity seemed to intensify. Pebbles became stones, stones became branches, dry trees bent, benches and even the nearby ice cream cart lifted. More and more objects floated, drawn into the slow rising orbit. He lost track of time. When he finally opened his eyes, several strangers stood beside him on the bench. The closest was smiling at him, Albus Dumbledore. Chapter 203, The Second Magic Awakening and the New World, the Leaky Cauldron. Eno drained half a glass of freshly squeezed grass juice and looked across the table at the old man with a sense of relief. "Professor, thank you for this. Otherwise, they would have given me a warning letter sooner or later." "It's not that serious." Dumbledore shook his head. "A wizard's magical awakening is, by nature, irresistible. You weren't using magic outside school of your own volition, so the Ministry of Magic wouldn't be so unreasonable. In that case, 3 years ago I already received my Hogwarts letter." Eno's words trailed off. The implication was obvious. If his magic was only awakening now, how had he been at Hogwarts 3 years before? It made no sense. "That can be explained. There are records in history." Dumbledore chuckled. "Magic is like an intricately painted, 1,000-petaled narcissus. Seen from different angles, it shows different beauty. Each perspective brings a new experience." "So I just changed my perspective?" Eno gave him a look. Dumbledore always spoke in riddles. It was strange to hear someone else talking in circles. Sensing Eno's impatience, the old headmaster dropped the metaphor and spoke plainly. "My point is this: no one can explain magic fully, and no one understands all of it. Your case is rare, but not unique. Across the long river of history, every so often, a shining star appears." That straightforward answer settled Eno. Perhaps, as Dumbledore said, magic defied clear explanation. If it could be perfectly explained, maybe it would stop being magic. He no longer pushed the origin, but he still wanted to know the consequences or benefits of a second magical awakening. Taking advantage of Dumbledore's free hour, he asked directly. "There's nothing dramatic," Dumbledore replied calmly. "It's much like a young wizard's first awakening. The main effect is an increase in your magic." At the word increase, Eno shrugged. With the sanctuary around, passive magical growth was already available to him. Still, he was curious about the scale. For something as vague as magic, besides age, what did one compare it to? "So, roughly what level is this increase?" he asked, cautiously. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled. "Ha, now you could duel Severus, provided you have the dueling skills, of course." He blinked as if imagining the match, a mischievous grin on his face. "That's my dean." Eno half pouted, half laughed. Unreliable as ever, Dumbledore had still given him the answer he wanted. His magic was now roughly on par with Snape's. In a better mood, Eno ordered another glass of grass juice for himself and a honey lemonade for Dumbledore from Old Tom. Evening, Hogsmeade. Back in his small house, a greenish flame dancing in the fireplace, Eno lay on the second-floor bed and replayed the afternoon. The ministry officials in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes might have missed something, but he didn't believe Dumbledore had. What surprised him even more was that the old headmaster hadn't once mentioned the boggart. Not deaf, not mute, not a master. Eno marveled at the man's wisdom. Playing dumb about certain things was often wiser than demanding clarity. Asking for explanations could imply distrust, and distrust bred complications. The room quiet, his mind spinning from the day's events, Eno checked the boggart as he always did. From the second vantage point, a mass of ink-black smoke had begun to seep out from the shadows. It was no longer the palm-sized wisp it had been. After absorbing fear from several people that day, it had grown by at least a circle. What had been a teacup before was now a small kettle. The black mist floated in midair. A sudden impulse rose in him to make it disperse. In a wizarding village like Hogsmeade, a boggart should not be left to grow. Fear feeds on magic, he murmured, tasting the thought. He roughly understood the source of the urge. The boggart had originally formed from magic, a conscious mass of fear. Though the sanctuary had erased its higher intelligence, its instinct remained. Previously, it had been too weak to do much, but after absorbing fresh fear, that native instinct had rekindled. Feeling the pull, Eno decisively raised his wand. Expecto Patronum. A shimmering silver cloud sprang into being. On the second floor, two mists hovered, one black and one silver. They were opposites not only in color but in the emotions they embodied. The Patronus radiated joy and protection, the boggart dark fear. The silver light drove away the insistent impulse. The brief, dangerous tug at his heart ebbed. A long-forgotten flutter, a call into a new story, stirred him, and he immediately dispelled the charm. The Patronus faded, and the black mass sank back into the shadows, the snow-blanketed sanctuary. As the smoke along the main road cleared, a bustling town spread out, packed with people shoulder to shoulder. The scene looked ancient, older than the Middle Ages. The clothing and transport spoke of low productivity, gray and white linen garments, human-pulled handcarts, and crude ox carts. Eno glanced at his dark blue robe and decided to change. He took on the clothes he'd worn in Shankytown, a coarse gray linen robe, straw sandals woven from palm leaves, a bundled suitcase strapped like a pack on his back, and a 2-meter rowan staff in his hand. With that dress, he fit the setting and read as a wandering traveler. He stepped onto the packed snow and walked slowly into this new story world. It's the beginning of the month. Xiao Di is asking for votes. Please cast a vote. Xiao Di's magical creature sharing today. Goal, British Ministry of Magic. Classification level XX. Appearance. Ghouls are ugly but not especially dangerous. They resemble man-eating trolls. Habits. Ghouls generally live in the attics or barns of wizarding households, feeding on spiders and moths. They're always groaning and sometimes toss things around, but they're simple-minded and at worst will only bellow at those who disturb them. In some families, ghouls are merely the subject of after-dinner gossip. Some even become like household pets. Abilities and uses. Related knowledge. There are other ghoul varieties, such as chameleon ghouls, which can disguise themselves as everyday objects to avoid detection. Hermione once read about chameleon ghouls in a book, which is why she thought of them when she, Harry, and Ron discussed why the creatures in the Chamber of Secrets had gone undiscovered for so long. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures even has a ghoul task force to remove ghouls living in Muggle dwellings. Chapter 204, Helena and the Market. In less than a second, silence gave way to noise, cold to bustle. Eno stood by the roadside, leaning on his staff, as the sounds of the market filled his ears. Yet in that crowd, his appearance didn't seem strange. In a constantly moving market, no one would notice if a single person quietly arrived or slipped away. He had lifted his foot to ask someone for directions when a small hand caught the strap of his palm leaf sandals. "Are you a priest of the temple?" Helena felt lucky. She had thought it was just an ordinary market day and, as usual, had gathered enough olive branches from the hills to sell. The sudden arrival of this stranger made her heart flutter, like a scene from a story come to life. Now he seemed about to leave. Looking at the clean, flawless robe, she didn't dare touch it. She half knelt and clutched at his sandals. The palm leaf sandals were immaculate, not even a speck of dirt, which only strengthened her belief. Ino turned and saw a 7 or 8-year-old child half kneeling behind him. Without hesitation, he crouched down and gently helped the small figure up. The child was a girl. Though her face was smudged with grime, her eyes were unforgettable, violet gems, bright and curious, peering at the world like a newly hatched chick. Facing those eyes, Ino softened his voice. "I'm not a priest of the temple. I'm just a traveler from another land, a wandering bard." "But I think you are." The girl had poured all her courage into the sentence, then ducked her head again. Ino, who had grown up in an orphanage, found himself helpless against such pitiful little faces. He set his bag down, sat on the ground to be at her eye level, and asked gently, "Then tell me, what kind of priest do I look like?" Perhaps it was the calm eye contact or the soft tone, but this time she didn't shrink away. "I think you're a priest of the sun god Apollo. In stories he used to be a bard, and his lyre came from the laurel nymph Daphne." Her voice trailed off. Ino stopped listening to the rest. The names she had spoken, classical era, temple priest, sun god Apollo, laurel goddess Daphne, snapped into place in his mind and pointed unmistakably to a vast mythic world, the Greek gods. Unlike many pantheons that hid their divinities, the gods of Olympus were brazenly visible. The age of the gods began with Zeus, who overthrew his father Cronus and took the throne as king of the gods. Zeus was more restrained than his predecessor, but his appetites were as vast as Poseidon's sea. Sisters, aunts, daughters, nieces. Zeus had 7 wives and countless lovers. More than 20 names are recorded, and many more remain unnamed. He even had a transgender lover, the figure associated with the constellation Aquarius, Ganymede. Ganymede had been a handsome prince whose beauty drew Zeus's eye. Zeus transformed into a giant eagle, abducted him to Olympus, and made him his cupbearer. Hera, humiliated by the relationship, punished Ganymede by turning him into a transparent water vessel, forcing him to fill and pour water for Zeus for the rest of his life, the water said to be his own tears. Grieved to see his lover so reduced, Zeus placed Ganymede among the stars as the constellation Aquarius. Compared with other mythologies, Greek myth could be summarized in one word: chaos. A large portion of the stories from the Age of the Gods revolve around Zeus's endless dalliances. If not for Hera's jealousy keeping things in check, the roster of Olympus might have grown even more crowded. The market on the Aegean coast hummed with life. In a quiet corner, 2 figures, one large, one small, sat behind a 2-foot square of linen on which fresh olive branches were neatly arranged. Athens, the city under Athena's protection, prized olive branch headbands, so the branches were popular, but precisely because headbands were so common, tiny stalls selling only raw olive branches were often overlooked. Behind the cloth, Ino produced 2 butterscotch candies from his bag and handed one to Helena, then picked up an olive branch to examine it. In Greek stories, olive branches were never merely ordinary foliage. They carried the weight of gods, legends, and heroes. They symbolized peace, and the gods had invested them with nobility and renewal. "Do you like it? I'll give it to you." Helena's eyes curved into crescents as she smiled. Ino took another candy from his bag and offered it, then shook his head and said, "This is your merchandise. I don't want it." He knew it would be useless to take it. Once removed, the branches returned to being ordinary sticks. Helena's eyes, however, were fixed on the white candy. Her small, dirty hands, no bigger than in an adult's palm, were cupped together. Seeing that, Ino felt a stab of sadness. Children should not have to suffer. They were always the most innocent. Helena hurriedly rubbed her hands on her clothes, trying to clean them, but the fabric was just as filthy. As she watched her hands get even dirtier, she turned away, crestfallen. Then she felt something pebble-like pressing into her palm. Looking back, she found a handful of small, colorful, smooth beads in her hand. "These taste even better. Try them. Each one tastes different." Ino reached out, picked a Birdie Bot's every flavor bean from Helena's dirty little palm, and popped it into his mouth. Time passed by minute, second by second. After devouring 2 bags of Birdie Bot's every flavor beans, It had already become afternoon, and the market was thinning out. Eno leaned against a wall, trying to braid an olive branch circlet from memory in the style of Thranduil's crown. He'd been at it for hours. Helena had managed to sell only one bundle of fresh olive branches, bartered away for a single piece of bread. One piece of bread a day. He could hardly imagine how the child survived. If he could teach her to make a new kind of circlet, it might give her a skill to earn a living. Athens, a coastal city, felt the Aegean in the afternoon, a warm, humid breeze that swept past like a poem. The wind seemed to carry a Merperson's song, enchanting, almost hypnotic. After finishing his third experimental circlet, Eno set the olive branches down. The awkward loops on the ground proved he had no real talent for weaving. Helena glanced at them, and a faint smile curved her lips before it faded. The market was nearly over, and closing meant parting, which meant she'd be alone again. While Helena worried, Eno's thoughts drifted to his itinerary. He had no intention of getting involved with the gods of Olympus. Their capriciousness always ruined ordinary lives. Myth after myth showed the same cruelty. The Trojan War, the story of Medusa. Cities fallen because three goddesses argued, a beautiful maiden raped by Poseidon and then punished by Athena, innocents suffering for the gods' whims. Those without powerful patrons always ended badly. Eno had decided to live simply, to avoid glory and danger alike. If small, ordinary stories came his way, he wouldn't mind, but he would not touch anything that smacked of gods or heroes. To a bard like him, a story was a story, short or long, fable or epic. Length didn't equal worth. A few lines of Aesop could change a life. A long epic might thrill many and leave nothing behind. As he drifted, the sundial's shadow slid into a new position. A few distant horn calls announced the market's end, and vendors began to pack up. Helena folded her linen cloth and tied her bundle with practiced ease, slinging it over her shoulder with movements so efficient it hurt to watch. "I have to go. Athens doesn't let vagrants stay overnight," she said. Her voice held disappointment, but her large violet eyes shone with a sliver of hope. The scene pulled at something in Eno, an echo of a memory 5 years old. Perhaps teacher Hans had seen something similar in him back then. The offer had been the same. "If you're willing, you can be my apprentice. Learn to be a bard, at least you won't starve." And now, outside Athens, Eno found himself saying the very same words to Helena. He slung his satchel over his shoulder, leaning on a mountain ash staff, and followed her along a rough path toward Mount Hymettus to the east. The mountain, famous for its honey and herbs, was blanketed in wildflowers. Their faint perfume and the calls of birds returning to roost made the air sing. Before nightfall, Helena led him into a hidden valley. "Eno, this is where I live. Now it's yours too," she said, turning with a bright, proud smile. "You should call me teacher." Eno looked at her helplessly. No matter what he said, she wouldn't stop insisting. Still, he was touched by the trust she placed in him. If their roles were reversed, he thought, he probably wouldn't take a stranger in for a few candies. "You live here?" he asked, surveying the valley. There wasn't even a proper shelter against wind and rain. At his bleakest, he'd at least had an archway over the Thames. Helena grinned and pointed. "Look!" Eno followed her small hand to a stand of olive trees, and perched among the branches was a tiny tree house, more like an oversized bird's nest than a dwelling, with a scant bit of shelter from the rain. The crude construction clashed with Helena's innocent pride. He stood silent a moment, then drew his wand. "Helena, teacher has a welcome gift." Helena's astonishment lit her face as a little miracle unfolded. Around the base of the olive tree, solid pillars of ice sprang up and fanned outward until, within seconds, a 2-story structure of ice and snow had formed. Eno waved his wand again, focusing on a transfiguration charm. He saw, in Helena's small shape, the reflection of his own past. Without the sanctuary, he might have died in the orphanage or drifted into some lowly job in London. Hogwarts and magic had been a miracle for him. He wanted that same kind of miracle for Helena. As he completed the spell, the ice building shone with blinding white light. When it faded, the structure that had been ice was a house of white marble, gleaming and solid. Helena leaped up, clapping. "You still say you're not a temple priest," she teased, eyes wide with wonder. Chapter 206, The Real Temple. Under the shroud of Nyx, goddess of the night, Mount Hymettus lay unusually silent. Of course, the quiet would be short-lived. When Apollo drove his sun chariot across the sky tomorrow morning, the world would be bright and busy again. In a secluded valley on the mountain stood a two-story house of white marble. By candlelight, a small figure moved about busily. Eno sat in the hall on the ground floor, smiling as he watched. Helena, like a little hamster, scurried from corner to corner, carrying prized bits and pieces, broken statuettes, old wooden boxes, and a jumble of odds and ends. He didn't use magic to help her. He knew the simple pleasure of settling into a new home came from this very kind of work. He remembered his own joy when he had moved out from under the bridge to Hogsmeade and built his furniture and arranged his room with his own hands. Helena didn't have many belongings. After a while, the last linen awning was hauled into place and the moving finished. "Take a break. Come and eat something," Eno said. He opened his suitcase and took out a few pieces of cheese, some sweets from Honeydukes, and a small barrel of butterbeer. Helena obeyed and came to the table, but she didn't reach for the food. Instead, she nervously clasped her small hands together and murmured, "Aguamenti." A quarter of an hour later, Helena was no longer a grimy child. She wore a clean, simple linen dress that made her look neat and fresh. The only thing striking about her was how ordinary she was. She wasn't ugly, but she lacked conspicuous beauty, an ordinary face set against jewel-like violet eyes that somehow seemed a little out of place. Eno nodded in satisfaction. In Greek myth, beauty could be a curse. Too many people met tragic ends because of it. A plain, common face could be a kind of safeguard. Helena munched sweets with a blissful expression, chatting between bites. "Whose priestess are you exactly? The goddess of the harvest? The sun god?" Eno waved a hand. "I told you I'm not a priest of any god. Think of me as a magic user." "You're a priest," Helena insisted, half serious. "Fine, but when you finish eating, go upstairs and sleep early. Tomorrow I'll take you into Athens to tell stories. Your job is to watch and listen carefully." He rose and headed for the inner room. He had no intention of correcting Helena's misunderstanding. In an age when gods manifested visibly, many people's ideas were slow to change. Not far away in Athens, in a marble palace as white as the moon, several maids in linen dresses fussed around a beautiful young girl as if she were the center of the world. The girl stood barefoot, her fair skin mellow in the candlelight, her outer robe giving her an ethereal air. Behind her loomed a colossal statue, nearly 10 meters tall and carved from ivory. It wore a war helmet, was draped in a long Greek robe, held a spear in its right hand, and clutched a round shield embossed with reliefs in its left. After a moment, the girl spoke, her voice light and teasing as it echoed through the temple. "Heh! Another favorite of the gods has come to Athens." The maid stiffened at the unusual tone and became more solemn. Back on Mount Hymettus before dawn, Eno sat on the grass with his gaze fixed on the eastern sky. Night receded, and a faint line of dawn appeared on the horizon. He had risen extra early to meet this moment. A golden glow spread, and for an instant, in that first ray of sunlight, he thought he saw a golden chariot, only a flash, but enough to shatter the last shred of hope he had been clutching. He leaned back in his chair, feeling somewhat defeated. "What are you looking at?" Helena's voice came from behind. She was already dressed and standing beside him. "The sunrise," Eno said without trying to hide it. He hadn't needed to. "Sunrise?" Helena looked up, puzzled. "Only those favored by the gods can see the sun god's chariot." He said nothing. In Athens, in a quiet corner of the bustling market, an unusually attentive crowd had gathered. Though there were many people, the place was hushed. Everyone leaned forward as two figures sat in the center, one large, one small. A soft harp accompanied a story. There are 1,000 roses in the world, and yet in a garden full of blooms, the little prince still missed his rose. In that moment, he understood what true love is. Eno told the tale of the little prince, a deliberate choice. In an age of living gods, a love story was the safest thing to speak of. When the story ended, the main event began. Eno looked up, giving a practiced, gentle smile. In front of him stood a young girl in white linen. To the left in the crowd, a refined-looking blonde youth watched with steady interest. Around them, among the listeners, were others whose bearing and appearance marked them as more than ordinary onlookers. The morning throve with the soft hush of a city that, for a moment, listened. Athens City, at a corner of the bustling marketplace. Eno wanted to ask the people gathered there, if only for the sake of spite, whether they had nothing better to do with their days. But some things are understood without words. More important than teasing was resolving the awkwardness. Leaving a story half told needed explanation. Around him, faces showed curiosity, admiration, contemplation. Helena shifted at his side and clutched his tunic. Her violet eyes were wide. She peered nervously at the crowd. The small, involuntary grip steadied him. Once, when he had followed his mentor Hans, he had never had to worry. He would not let Helena live constantly on edge. So he stopped explaining, inclined his head, and sat back on the little stool. The 36-string Irish harp sang again. This time the melody carried a quiet strength beneath its beauty. Eno smoothed Helena's short hair and began. The fox told the little prince that life is about meeting and parting. In those meetings, we learn what love is. If you want to form a bond, you must accept the risk of tears. The story unfolded slowly with the music. The tale of the little prince was not long. It took just over an hour. At the end, Eno stitched the scenes together in a brief montage. The little prince bitten by a venomous snake, then waking in his tiny castle where he could watch 44 sunsets in a single day. The proud, demanding voice of the rose reached him, and he understood he had merely slept, experienced a very, very long dream. The harp's last note died away. A single, crisp clap sounded from the crowd. Eno glanced up and saw a handsome, golden-haired youth standing to the left. The youth applauded, drew a derrick from his pocket, and stepped forward. As he moved, many onlookers made way for him. Only a girl in white linen remained. "What a romantic story," the youth said as he tossed the coin onto the frayed cloth spread on the ground. "I prefer the ending. It's best not to wake until you know how to love. That way, you avoid tragedy." His voice flowed like a cool stream, a pleasant, insinuating sound. Eno noticed his gaze flick toward the harp. With the golden hair, he guessed who the youth was. Still, etiquette mattered. Facing a reward, Eno rose, bowed, and thanked him quietly. "Thank you for your recognition and generosity. Spreading beautiful stories is my work." He reached to pick up the coin. It didn't look like a Greek drachma. Its design hinted at Persian mintage. Just as his fingers neared it, two hands came down on the linen, one fair and slender, carved like ivory, the other small and gentle. They paused for a beat. The fair fingers closed on the coin. "I am the Athens city security manager," the girl in linen said with a soft, amused laugh. "This counts as your entrance fee. From now on, whether you stay in the city overnight or anything else, no further fees will be charged." The golden-haired youth had watched the exchange the whole time without anger. Instead, he sounded amused and interested. "If you have more good stories, or want to earn money, or need any other assistance, come to me. You know where to find me." When the crowd drifted apart, the market corner fell back into its usual quiet. Helena puffed out her cheeks and muttered, "They're all bad people, stealing." Eno smiled wryly and patted her shoulder. "Don't make trouble. We can't afford enemies. It's just one gold coin. Let them have it." He hadn't expected the little prince's story to draw so much attention, nor had he suspected anyone would dare touch Apollo's things. Standing there in the Aegean breeze, he had a fair guess at the girl's identity. Someone bold enough to snag even Zeus's possessions. Still, there was nothing to be gained from arguing. "What do we do next?" Helena asked, gathering their things and standing obediently with two small stools. Eno hesitated. Questions about the future were heavier than most spells. For a moment he had no answer. Then he made one on impulse, tempered by care. "The future can wait. For now, we'll go to the market and buy some things. I'll teach you another skill." They returned to the valley before dusk, their load noticeably heavier than in the morning. Earthenware jars and bowls, sacks of wheat, and several wooden molds. Wandering as a bard was one thing. Helena needed a skill that would keep her safe. Baking, making bread and pastries, would do that. Good pastries from another world would be a rare and valuable trade in this place. Whether she opened a bakery in Athens or baked in the valley and sold at the market, she would no longer have to fear hunger. Hunger, he thought. Such a simple word, but for children without support it was the most merciless thing. Ragged clothes and dirt could be borne, empty bellies could not. "Helena, come here. I'll teach you another skill today." He untied a sack and poured the yellow, slightly coarse flour into a prepared container. Chapter 208. We are not afraid of her, Mount Hymettus. In a small valley a few hundred meters across, wildflowers bloomed in a riot of colors. In the middle of them stood a neat white marble cottage. A few olive trees grew beside the house, each 6 or 7 meters tall, their trunks wide enough for a person to wrap both arms around. Inside the room, Eno gently wiped sweat from Helena's forehead with a towel and glanced at the basket of fresh flowers she had brought back. "Don't be so hasty," he said. "I forgot to tell you, don't pick just any flower. Making flower cakes needs specific edible flowers." "But they're all edible. I ate them all," Helena said seriously. She truly had. She hadn't only tried the flowers, she'd tasted the olives too. When she was hungry, she sampled nearly everything in the valley. Eno sighed softly and looked into her bright violet eyes. A casual, "I ate them all," carried a weight he knew well. People who'd never been desperately hungry couldn't imagine the sleepless nights it caused. "It won't happen again," he murmured. "Come, I'll teach you how to crush the petals properly." Time's chariot moved on silently. Half a month slipped by in an instant. In calm stretches of life, people barely noticed time passing or the changes around them. A small bakery called Flowers opened in Athens. Tucked away on a lane not far from the temple, it was an honor to be so near, but with honor came consequences. The shop was unlikely to get many customers. Though it was less than 30 square meters, Eno always felt like it stood alone in the wilderness. Everything around the temple was too quiet. The Athenians' reverence for Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, seemed to silence the streets. Passers-by walked with the soft, instinctive caution of people in a sacred place. If he could have chosen, Eno wouldn't have put the shop here. He might not have opened one at all. He was meant to leave, and Helena alone couldn't keep a business going. A shop would not only fail to provide, but might become a burden. But some matters were not his to decide. When the invitation came from Athena, few mortals in all of Greece would think to refuse. He was still lost in thought when faint footsteps came from outside. A small figure burst in, as usual. "La la la! I sold out again!" Helena announced, dropping her little basket on the counter and setting a handful of mixed coins beside it. "Athens is busiest before a festival. I hadn't even reached the market, and they'd already bought all the flour cakes." She said it with mock grown-up analysis. At 7 or 8, she always seemed a few years older than her size suggested. "Rest a bit. You can't keep all that money," Eno replied, lifting her onto a chair. "As your teacher, it's not just my job to teach you the craft. I have to teach you the temper that should come with it." He looked at those gem-like eyes and thought of the one lesson that kept them safe in this world of gods. Stay quiet and avoid trouble. "Helena, don't be greedy. It's enough that we don't starve. Too much wealth only brings trouble." He was still explaining when a playful voice interrupted. "You should go say that on Mount Olympus, so they know greed has consequences." The girl who'd snatched a gold coin earlier stood in the doorway. Eno rose and bowed. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen Athena several times over the prior fortnight. What did surprise him was how idly she seemed to be standing now. No matter how casual her bearing, she was one of the 12 Olympians and deserved respect. "You flatter me," he said humbly. "Mount Olympus is not a place for mortals like me." He had always kept his dealings with the gods quiet and respectful. That approach had kept things smooth so far. Today, however, something felt different. For a long moment, Athena made no characteristic playful laugh. "Are you afraid?" Her voice lost its teasing edge and took on a sharper seriousness. "If you're afraid, you shouldn't have come forward. And you certainly shouldn't have chosen a favored one so soon, or secretly built a sanctuary on Mount Hymettus." Her calm words fell on him like thunder from a clear sky. He almost staggered. Athena watched him closely and chuckled, but there was no kindness in it. "You really don't understand anything, do you? I don't know what to say to you." After a beat, Eno lifted his head to meet her gaze. For the first time, he really took her in. Beautiful as a work of art, but she didn't wear the fierceness of a warlord. "What is it I need to know?" he asked. "That's not me." Athena's voice snapped as if she had read his thought. "You have divinity, but you don't have the corresponding authority. Otherwise, why would Apollo be so generous as to give you gold coins?" She went on, her voice cool. After the festival, come to my temple. There are things to discuss. For one, Mount Hymettus belongs to Athena. Perhaps it was annoyance, perhaps something else. Athena left, but not before agreeing to meet after the festival. As she disappeared, Ino stayed motionless for a long time, his mind tangled. He could accept divinity in some forms. After all, the sanctuary that had appeared was a miracle, as were the flame of hope, the ice magics, and the other stories he'd heard. The black swan magician, the Huttonmar lantern bearer. Those phenomena could be called divine within the Greek system. That part wasn't the real puzzle. What frightened him was the word sanctuary. He'd built a simple 2-story house in the valley. How had it become a sanctuary? And what did that imply? From Athena's tone, it sounded like trouble. She had been blunt. Mount Hymettus belonged to Athena. Things had moved too fast, and he hadn't been ready for any of it. Helena didn't seem to share his worry. She lifted her small chin and announced solemnly, "We are not afraid of her. The valley is mine. I was here first." Ino chuckled and tousled her short hair. The little girl didn't know who she'd just faced. In her mind, this was only like a market stall. Whoever arrived first owned it. Chapter 209, Athena Festival. In Greece, the Panathenaea was the event everyone waited for. Held once every 4 years, it drew representatives from every territory under Athens' sway. No matter how far they came, they were expected in the city to participate in the rites. They brought fresh embroidered robes and animal sacrifices for Athena. When the sacrifices were over, the city hosted a week of athletic contests and musical competitions, spectacles whose scale could rival and at times even surpass the Olympic Games. That the festival of a single goddess could so subtly compete with the games dedicated to Zeus spoke to how widely Athena was supported. Rumors that Athena might one day overthrow Zeus were inevitable in the face of such a display, but Ino didn't much care for gossip. He didn't fear the Greek gods the way others did. It wasn't arrogance so much as a pragmatic indifference. If he couldn't beat them, he could run. He had tricks of his own, apparition, the phoenix he kept in his briefcase, things that could change the rules of pursuit. He had heard of the gods' bravery and command, but he had never seen one teleport. Zeus mostly took the form of an eagle and flew. The gods of Olympus earned his respect, not terror. Their power system was simply different, and even if they could come after him, he could wait it out, 3 years, 5 years, then return when it suited him. The gods were not monolithic anyway. Factional strife and leftover threats like the Abyss Titans complicated their unity. All the same, Ino preferred not to make enemies unless he had to. Looking at the small girl beside him, he saw his own reflection, an orphan, helpless and alone. That likeness made him oddly protective. As Panathenaea approached, Ino closed his shop. Money was endless enough, and if he angered Athena, there would be no amount of coin to save him. The shop had always been for Helena, anyway. On the morning of the festival, the sun rose as usual. Helena woke unusually early and began rummaging through her old wooden chest. Ino sat nearby in the living room, watching the busy little figure with a soft sort of attention. He knew the way lonely children treasured small things, a pretty candy wrapper, a faded button. Before long, Helena produced her favorite, a thin, rectangular strip of black gauze. "This was left to me by my mother," she said proudly, holding it up. "That's wonderful," Ino replied genuinely. He had always envied children who had something from their parents, a tangible piece of family. For a moment, a shadow of what he had once had crossed him. Helena patted over, and with the solemnity only a child can muster, offered him a share. "I'll give you half, then you'll have some too." Her little hands clasped together as if ready to tear the scarf in two. Ino opened his arms and drew her into a hug. He was taken aback by the seriousness of her generosity. For a child who had grown up wandering, willing to divide her most cherished possession, that was extraordinary. He kissed the top of her head. "This was left to you by your mom. You must take good care of it. I'll give you something of mine in the future," he whispered in her ear. The city was packed when they reached Athens. Helena sat on his shoulders, grinning, candy in one hand and the black gauze tied around the other wrist. Street performers juggled and sang. The air smelled of roasted meat and wax. "Ino, there's juggling over there. Move a bit to the side. There's a tree in the way," she called. In which direction is to the side, left or right? He said with mock exasperation, learning the new pains of watching a child in a crowd. Helena blinked, puzzled. Then she lurched forward and pointed with the hand that had the black gauze. This way! Sit still! Don't wiggle! Ino patted her extended arm and steered them through the press of people. The daytime had been for the goddess's sacrifices. The mortal festivities were only getting started as night fell. The city did not quiet at sunset. It grew louder and wilder. Not far from the temple, their bakery was closed for the festival. Inside the shop, two figures, one large, one small, stayed behind. Are you sure you don't want to come with me? Ino asked as he tied his cloak. You have to promise to stay here and not run out. I won't run, Helena said, blinking, every bit as serious as before. He wanted to take her along. Everything about the festival made him uneasy, but she was resolute. He hugged her quickly, reminded her again to stay put, and crossed the street toward the temple alone. The temple wasn't far. When he reached the entrance, a young woman in white linen waited on the steps. The goddess commanded me to fetch you. Please follow me, she said softly. The voice and manner were different from the temple attendants he'd known. Ino realized it could only mean Athena herself was present inside. It made sense. Such a grand festival couldn't be managed by mere projections. He sighed and followed the maiden through. 46 massive stone columns rose like guardians. The pristine marble pavement gleamed faintly in the fading light. Fountains whispered between sculpted reliefs that told old heroic tales. Everywhere, the city's devotion to the goddess was on display in marble and craft. Ino looked at it all without enthusiasm. He did not want to be dragged into the affairs of that great household. Still, he went where he had been summoned. Chapter 210. I'll be away for a while today. Sorry, everyone. Xiao Di hasn't finished writing yet, so today's update will be a little late. It will be up by 9 at the latest. Sorry. The Temple of Athena could easily be called one of the finest and most magnificent sanctuaries in all of Greece. Inside, the air fell into a hushed reverence. The young woman who had led him in earlier slipped away quietly, as if her duty were done. A towering statue dominated the temple's center. Gold and ivory inlaid with gems, casting a dawn-like glow under the flicker of countless candles. But when Ino looked at it, he could not help remembering the poor people he had seen in the market, those who lived beyond Athens' walls, who wore faded, threadbare clothes, yet gave up everything they had to the goddess. The offerings and treasures at the statue's base must be worth enough to feed dozens of families for years. Did Athena truly love humanity that much? Ino shook his head internally. He held no certain answer. As a passerby, though, he kept his place. A guest, especially an unannounced one, knew how to behave. For believers, there are many choices: harvest, light, love, healing, a voice murmured behind him. Ino turned. A woman with long wine-red hair and a white embroidered silk dress stepped forward, her bare feet whispering on the marble. He averted his gaze quickly. Looking up at the goddess' face might be acceptable, but gawking at her feet felt disrespectful. They choose, and I choose, the woman said as she lifted her skirt and sat with measured grace on the temple's central throne. Only the sincere receive blessings. I have been merciful. Only the people of Athens are not playthings for the gods. Ino found himself silently agreeing. Compared to other places in the age of gods, Athenians were fortunate. They were not casually toyed with. Look up now, the voice on the throne said, clear and firm. It's time to speak of our matters. Ino did not feign timidness. He raised his head. This was his first time seeing Athena in the flesh. She sat bathed in a faint sacred radiance. At first, the light stung his eyes. Then some magic within him responded, a coolness settling into his vision until the soreness eased. Her face was noble and beautiful, but what he remembered most were her silver eyes, deep and piercing, as if they could see past the flesh to the soul beneath. When his amber eyes met that silver gray, a chill swept the temple. Temperature plunged. A pale frost crept across the marble floor, inching outward until, inexplicably, it would not cross the space around Athena's crystal-clear feet. "Fide!" Ino called without hesitation. A streak of blue light flashed, and a small phoenix alighted on his left shoulder. The bird, Fide, cocked his head and surveyed the room with obvious irritation and a ranting look in his glittering eyes. "Your Excellency, I don't want trouble," the phoenix squawked. "I never meant any harm. If you want that house in Hymettus Valley gone, I'll blow it up right now. It's easy." Though annoyed at having his mind probed, Ino kept his temper under a brittle politeness. Athena's reply had a faint playfulness. "You're angry? The temple may be demolished, but what of the divine favored?" Those words cut. For the first time since childhood tales, since the fantastic stories, and even in the world of magic, where he'd always kept a detached interest, Ino felt real anger. He had always hovered at the edges of narratives, a catalyst, a passerby, never stealing the protagonist's thunder. But Helena's fate was different. Not only did she resemble someone important to him, the whole chain of events had been shaped by his own hand. He could not stand for it, ending in tragedy. Responsibility mattered. "Then try it," he said, voice hardening. "Exchange Helena's life for the entire city of Athens and all its subject city-states. Let them lose life itself and be swallowed by eternal ice." He drew a breath and met Athena's stare. His eyes, once amber, shaded into a cold blue, barren and expressionless as a winter sky. Athena's laugh chimed like a bell. "Ha ha ha! And you say you are not angry?" The amusement faded. "I never intended to touch her. The moment she fled to Athens, I knew. I have been protecting her. It was you who drove her away, and my uncle who rules the sea." As Athena spoke, regret washed over Ino. Helena carried the blood of Pontus, the primordial sea god, yet she lacked the divine authority that would go with such lineage. Pontus, the personification of the sea itself, was among the oldest names of divinity. A descendant without its power faced humiliation when measured against Poseidon, who now held dominion over the oceans. That made Helena a potential embarrassment and a threat, small but real. The memory of their first meeting returned. Even then, Ino had sensed there was something unusual about Helena's background, but he had not pressed it. Everyone had secrets. He himself had kept secrets, and teacher Hans had not cast him out. What he had taken for a small personal secret turned out to involve Poseidon, one of the great powers of the sea. The jealous pettiness of the Greek gods made Helena's fate precarious. Athena's willingness to speak of it openly, however, implied she had some means and conditions to deal with it. "State your terms," Ino said plainly. "I will do what I can." In the hush of the temple, Athena began to speak again, her voice a steady chant. "We are not as complicated as you think. I protected her simply to annoy someone. You know about Medusa," she went on. "What happened is in the past, but that does not mean I can forget." Ino listened. Many versions of the Medusa myth existed. The one Athena described was brutally plain. Medusa had once been a beautiful priestess of Athena's temple. She was assaulted by the sea god in that sacred place, violated in the house of worship. Poseidon suffered no punishment. Medusa alone became the object of shame and punishment. Athena's voice held the weight of that remembered injustice, and in it lay the reason she had kept an eye on Helena. When Athena finished speaking, the temple fell into an eerie silence. In that hush, you could almost hear the olive oil lamps crackling as they burned. After a long moment, Ino broke the quiet. If she brought this up, she must have a plan. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "It wasn't a big deal at first," Athena said, studying the blue phoenix with an amused look. "But now I have a better idea." She smiled. "I'll give you an aphrodisiac. Go seduce Amphitrite. She's here in the temple. When you're done, have your bird bring you back. I'll guarantee your safety." Ino nearly choked. The Greek gods were so human, and Athena herself sounded like a scorned maiden with a mischievous streak. "Change the method of revenge," she said flatly, refusing without thinking. Seducing the sea queen in Poseidon's temple? That wasn't revenge, it was suicide. Then destroy his temple. Athena's expression cooled at once when Ino refused. Destroy the temple? Now that was an even more reckless suggestion. Faced with that escalation and after a moment of thought, Ino nodded. "All right, I'll do it, but not now." "What?" Athena raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Think carefully. Damaging another god's temple was a serious matter. Temples were the gods' faces. Unless a divine war broke out, none of them would cross that line." Athena was genuinely taken aback that Ino had agreed so readily. Ino met her daze with plain pragmatism. "I can help you blow off your steam and destroy his temple. I won't need your protection afterward. But you must promise Helena's safety first. Athena cut her off coldly. I gave you a chance to back out. The silent pause that followed made Athena a touch impatient. After a beat, she stood and spoke quietly. If you can do it, I'll make that girl my divine attendant. Ino listened. The title of divine attendant wasn't laden with political clout in myth, but it mattered. Hermes was little more than Zeus's messenger, yet the role gave him standing. As a divine attendant of one of the 12 Olympians, Helena would be documented and protected by divine rules. She would be safe, and so long as her patron god existed, she would have a kind of immortality. I'll do my best to destroy his temple, Ino promised. A voice from the dice muttered, whatever, the boredom in it obvious. Athena's change in mood made sense. She had found something diverting, and before she could enjoy it fully, discovered it might be a one-off. Ino felt relieved rather than triumphant. Ever since he'd found the sun god's chariot, he'd tried to keep a low profile. Fate had dragged him into this family regardless. Now, standing on the edge of leaving, he decided to take one last chance to be reckless and to secure Helena's safety before he went. Half an hour later, under cover of night, Ino left the temple. Athena grew increasingly perfunctory after the agreement, too lazy even to offer another word. He took that as his cue to go. He walked through the quiet streets and pushed open the bakery door. Helena looked up at him, worry plain on her face. I'm fine, he said. I might be leaving soon. She lowered her head. Do you have to leave? No choice. I came suddenly, and I'll leave the same way. But before I go, I'll give you a gift. You won't have to go hungry. He meant it. Time flowed on. Nearly half a year had passed since the Panathenaea. Helena had changed, more mature, but with a little of her childhood joy gone. Whether that was good or bad depended on your point of view. Ino knew only that maturity cost things you couldn't get back. He couldn't stop her from growing up. All he could do was spend more time with her while he still could. On Hymettus, the sea breeze from the Aegean kept the valley mild, winters rarely colder than 5 degrees Celsius, so flowers bloomed at odd intervals. Under a tall olive tree in that valley, Ino fiddled with a camera. Helena had been gloomy lately. He wanted to give her something to remember before he left. Just look straight ahead, and don't turn your head, he said as he adjusted the lens. Okay. She stood shyly beneath the tree. She trusted him despite the strange method. All right, don't move. He stepped back, crouched beside her, and pressed the shutter. The click of the camera sounded crisp in the still air, as if time had paused for a breath. Evening fell over the valley. Night swept in gently. In the room, a blue light flared, and Phoebe appeared. Ino smiled and ran his hand along the phoenix's cooling wings. He'd been worried about Fide. Finding a place for the bird felt like a blind man feeling an elephant. Clumsy, uncertain, and absurd after so many mistakes. He'd lost hope more than once, but the habit of holding Fide's tail feathers remained, like reaching into another blind box and hoping this time it would open. Chapter 213, Phoenix and Prometheus. The rugged, steep spines of the Caucasus rose into the sky. On a lonely peak, Prometheus lay chained to a great rock, fetters of divine make biting into his flesh. He had endured a day of the eagles tearing at him. He stared blankly at the dusk where the sun left a thin orange smear on the horizon, like a weakly burning ember. As a Titan, he had never regretted his deed. Fire was not a right reserved for the gods alone. Not far away, a sudden flash of blue light announced another arrival. Ino blinked, gathered himself, and looked around. When his eyes fell on the bound figure, he let out a long breath. You finally found the right place. Instead of answering, Fide, the little bird that accompanied him, gave a teasing chirp and pecked at Ino's hand twice before flitting off. Ino felt the sting on his index finger, but did not mind. He smoothed his robes and walked toward the rock. Prometheus, the thief of fire, was someone Ino admired. Ever since he had come into possession of the flame of hope, that admiration had only grown. To begin with, Ino had not planned to seek Prometheus out. As an outsider approaching a criminal titan, he would inevitably be suspected of ulterior motives, and such attention did not suit his usual low-key nature. But an agreement with Athena had changed his mind. If he could no longer stay in the shadows, there were things worth trying. Prometheus had felt movement nearby for some time, but the endless torment had left him too exhausted for distraction. He simply wanted to watch the last of the twilight before night swallowed the world. Then, a small, warm orange flame rose into being. At the sight of it, he allowed himself a smile he could not remember having felt in ages, perhaps since the first time humankind learned to hold fire. He looked at the familiar light and spoke in a voice like dry wood scraping together. Fire is hope. His voice was rasping from dice use. Hope, and also salvation, Eno added quietly, raising his wand. Salvation? Prometheus shook his head. The punishment Zeus meted out offers no salvation. Despite knowing how little chance there seemed to be of Prometheus being saved, Eno still tried to comfort him. Where there's hope, there can be salvation. Maybe not now, but it can come. My fire has none, Prometheus muttered, staring at the tiny flames before him. Then, with a sudden conviction that startled him, he added, But your fire has salvation. I am bound to this rock, the scarred Titan said, but I am still a Titan. For the sake of this flame, if I can help you, I will help. You misunderstand, Eno replied with a faint smile. I didn't come to rescue or plot. I only wanted to talk about fire. He told him then, as the light waned, the story of the phoenix, a magical creature reborn from fire. Prometheus listened, longing gathering in his eyes as if he could see that impossible bird soaring out of the flames. I have never seen one, Prometheus said softly, but I feel they must be kindred to fire itself. Eno nodded. They are born of fire, bear its spirit, and are immortal. Their conversation dwindled into silence. The last blush of twilight faded, and a cold wind swept through the Caucasus. Still, the little cluster of orange flame hovered between them, stubbornly alight as if mourning the vanished dusk. Prometheus fell quiet. Eno stood beside him, saying nothing more. If Prometheus would not speak, the flame would be their company. Time passed, measured only in the glowing steadiness of that tiny light. Prometheus broke the silence at last, repeating his lament once more. My fire has no salvation. After a moment, his voice rose again, steadier. But my fire has hope, tenacity, courage, and resistance. No gale could snuff that fragile fire. It burned on. Near Mount Hymettus, dawn light spilled into the valley. After washing, Eno set about the day's work. Before winter, he had to gather and store enough fresh flowers. Agreements were agreements, and life went on. Although he had come to terms with Athena, he still planned to teach Helena how to make flower cakes before he left. It was part of a legacy he wanted to pass on. The night on the Caucasus had given him much to think about. Fire, one of the primal elements, was itself a kind of inheritance. Prometheus's lament at the end, that the birth of the phoenix had, in its way, limited fire, unsettled him. Following Prometheus's vague guidance, Eno had sparked a small flame by rubbing dry grass together, the most primitive way to make fire. Watching that flame, he understood a little of the Titan's sorrow. Fire was fire. It should not be constrained in its growth. It also made him think of another growing flame in the magical world, fiendfire. On reflection, fiendfire probably resembled Prometheus's picture of fire, untamed, self-propagating, and bearing a fierce spirit, though its nature had skewed toward destruction. Still, Eno knew he could not use fiendfire. Not here, not now. He could not demonstrate that to a true master of fire. Walking through a valley awash with blooms, he let the question hang in his mind, whether to condense a phoenix for the coming Quidditch World Cup. With Fide at his side, many things had become easier. Maybe he didn't truly need another phoenix, since a phoenix apparition might suffice. Perhaps a flame that could grow and change would be more useful. Small author's note. Today, Xiao Di shares the story of Prometheus. His fate in Greek myth is tragic and moving. Prometheus, a titan angered by Zeus's tyranny and how mortals were treated, stole heavenly fire and gave it to humanity so they might cook, warm themselves, and see by its light. Zeus was furious and punished Prometheus by chaining him to a cliff in the Caucasus and sending an eagle each day to peck at his liver. Prometheus's liver would regrow each night, making the torment endless. He endured year after year, never yielding. Also, it's the beginning of the month. Xiao Di is asking for votes. Big bosses, please cast a vote. The southernmost tip of the Attica Peninsula rose from the sea in a jagged, majestic sweep. Cape Sunion perched 65 meters above the water, its cliffs forming a natural fortress that framed a three-sided panorama of sea. To the left, the Aegean glittered. Ahead, the deep Mediterranean stretched away. To the right, the Ionian opened into the distance. Sailors leaving the Aegean or Asia Minor saw Sunion first on the Greek mainland, and for generations, men had regarded it as a place of reverence. Every evening, the sun sank into the Aegean in an array of burning colors, the light and the calm sea combining into a picture that stayed with the heart. Out of that reverence rose a temple to the sea god, and beside it, a gigantic statue of Poseidon watched the horizon, trident in hand, and a crown of woven seaweed upon his brow. High above Sunion, an elegant black swan trailed wide circles in the stratosphere. Even at 10,000 meters, the statue below was unmistakable, the sea god poised with his weapon, silent and monumental against the cliff. The black swan dissolved and folded into the shape of a young man in a linen robe. Ino alighted on the reef and looked down at the broom that had been his, and then estranged for so long. There was a small reluctance, a residual resistance between rider and broom, but no freedom without it. After a brief moment, he swung onto it, and they rose again. He did not strike immediately. He waited for the right instant, the critical point at which a swift hit and a quicker escape would give him his best chance. Confronting Poseidon himself had never really been the plan. The gods' offensive styles might be narrow, but their defenses and curses ran deep. If they met face to face, Ino could not be sure he'd break their protections, and the curses that could follow were not something you gambled with. That did not mean he was cowed. Wizards were not inferior to the Greek gods in every respect. No story in the old myths spoke of time travel or of gods who could truly move through time. Not even Cronus, the ancient lord of time, could travel in time. He only controlled its flow. The same limits applied to space. Whatever gods could do, wizards could often match, and wizards also had tricks the gods did not. Time turners and undetectable extension charms were trivial examples. The gods could not, for instance, call down lightning if that was not their province. Poseidon could not command lightning, Hades could not make plants sprout, Apollo could not conjure water. Domains gave them power, and those domains were also their ceiling. So Ino's plan was simple: strike hard, then vanish. He would not linger a second longer than necessary. By dusk, the sea took on a molten sheen as the last light spilled across the waves. Feed the phoenix, small and blazing, preened on his shoulder and nudged his cheek with a beak of warm feathers. The gesture tightened something inside him. He pictured Prometheus' stubborn flame, the defiance and courage that burned despite everything. He drew a steady breath and let his wand rest in his fingers. Magic, he reminded himself, may be shaped and limited by raw power, but at root it flowed from a wizard's belief. Confringo, he said. The blasting curse is a high-grade spell. Its reach and devastation scale with the caster's force. Pettigrew had blown up half a street with it. Siamus had wrecked the long bridge with it. The difference was pure volume. Ino's wand spat a streak of orange-red like a bolt of volcanic light, and it struck the 100-meter statue dead center. The explosion rolled over the promontory in a thunderclap. The temple shuddered beneath the impact. The statue, however, did not crumble. The trident in its hand erupted in a blue radiance. Reliefs along the statue's base, nereids, hydras, merfolk, and other sea creatures, lit up and became pale blue phantoms, rising and swirling into a living, circling barrier around the temple. Ino had expected defenses. A great god's image would not fall to a single strike. If a lone spell could topple the sea god's effigy, then why would Poseidon be a sovereign of the sea instead of a temple sentinel? The first strike was only the opening gambit. He kept at it. Mounted on his broom, he poured everything he could into alternating volleys of hex and charm. Sectum sempra! Sectum sempra! The severing charm tore at the shimmering blue forms. It dulled them, split threads of their light, and set up ripples along the magical membrane. He had no interest in harming the temple's people. The priests and worshippers were innocent. His target was the statue and its power alone. The encounter was a test of patience as much as strength. The temple was a face, a first line, etiquette and show more than the deep roots of divinity. Simple defenses could frustrate small troublemakers and preserve dignity. Only those truly formidable would attempt to bypass them. Under Ino's onslaught, the sea creature barrier began to unravel. Light fragments burst and fluttered to the sea like exhausted motes. At last, the last strand broke. With a howl, the barrier exploded outward and sank into mist. The sky over the entire Attica Peninsula darkened in an instant. Winds rose and clouds thickened. The usually placid Aegean seethed with sudden, towering swells. Sea and air seemed to conspire, each wave a roaring beast driven by an invisible hand. In the surge of wind and foam, he saw the figure who had been watching all along. Poseidon stood upon the cresting water, unbowed, riding a chariot drawn by merfolk. Seaweed crowned his hair, the trident gleamed in his fist. He came, not with an army, but with the immovable, inevitable presence of the sea itself. Instead of fear, another visage appeared in Eno's mind for an instant, the flame and defiance of Prometheus, and that small blaze steadied him. "Confringo!" he shouted again. Fide flared at his shoulder, and the two of them vanished from the exact spot they'd been standing in a blink of blue brilliance. The red beam he sent seared across the salt-bright air and struck the statue like a comet. Fire and explosion poured outwards. The mountain of stone that had been Poseidon's likeness cleaved apart in a volcanic roar. The hundreds of meters tall figure toppled, crashed, and split into ruin on the cliff below. On Mount Olympus, the gods watched. The 12 Olympians and lesser deities alike turned their faces toward the sight, their expressions flickering among curiosity, amusement, and something like calculation. What had been a tale told in market corners now unfolded for them as a living scene. They leaned in as if at a theater door, eager for the next act to begin. Chapter 215, Return and Harvest. After a brief daze, Eno let out a long, involuntary sigh as he took in the familiar surroundings. Poseidon's aura had been overwhelming. Though it had seemed to come from a single person, it had felt like the entire ocean's wrath. The endless sea and all its creatures had been the god's will made manifest. It's finally over. Standing in the ice and snow sanctuary, Eno felt relief as he tossed the linen-wrapped suitcase aside. Whatever had happened was behind him. He was about to change and leave when a subtle tremor ran through the sanctuary and made him narrow his eyes. That movement was all too familiar. Previous openings of new paths had caused the same ripple. This time, however, he resolved that no matter what changes came, he would not dive back into Greek mythology. Outside the sanctuary, the thick fog that had blanketed the area began to churn, then slowly thin. Through the dissipating mist, a familiar sight emerged. A flower-filled valley, tall olive trees standing straight, and a small, white marble building. It was a perfect replica of that tranquil valley on Mount Hymettus. When the mist cleared completely and he stepped again onto soft earth, Eno felt something like a small, private miracle. It was the odd pleasure of returning to a place you've rented for years and suddenly finding your name on the lease. The house is the same, but everything looks better because it now belongs to you. Wandering among the blooming flowers, he felt pleased and satisfied. Now I can truly be self-sufficient. The valley wasn't tiny. By his estimate, the radius was at least 300 or 400 meters, somewhere around 100 acres. This was the sanctuary's core, not a magically expandable suitcase, so he had no intention of fundamentally changing it. He would keep it lush and green, maybe add a few magical plants to bring in some income. Neville's magical garden had made him jealous. Though he'd never seen it in person, he'd imagined beds full of Mimbalus mimbletonia and bubble pod plants and thought it would be beautiful. Back in London, the old black house at number 12, Grimald Place, was being reborn. The tapestries and portraits of the old regime were gone, the dim corridors and doxy-infested carpets replaced by new furniture and bright magical lamps. Sirius sat in the living room and looked around with a pleased expression. He had spent his first Christmas after his name was cleared with Harry, just as he'd wanted. "Creature, prepare dinner." Sirius glanced at the clock and called into the empty room. With a soft pop, a thin, elderly house elf appeared. White hair had shown in the bat-like ears he was known for. "Yes, master." Creature bowed, but respect did not reach his dull, bloodshot eyes. After the bow, instead of moving on, he muttered to himself in a voice just loud enough to hear. "The ungrateful prodigal master orders old Creature again, but old Creature can't. He broke his mother's heart, threw away the black family's honor." "My mother has no heart. She only had so-called honor," Sirius shot back coldly. "Oh, look, the prodigal master is angry. He isn't even fit to tie the mistress's shoes." Creature hadn't finished when Sirius cut him off. Do the work I ordered you to do. You are not to appear without permission, and you are not to mutter in front of me. Now, disappear." At the word order, Creature fell silent. He bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the floor, snapped his fingers, and was gone. Half an hour later, the dining room was bright under the glow of the lamps. Dishes lay steaming on the table. Harry looked at the spread but hesitated, then glanced at Sirius. "Is something wrong?" Sirius asked. "Tell me. I'll do whatever I can. Tomorrow I want to go to the Burrow. Ron invited me to stay for a few days," Harry said, fumbling the words. Staying at Grimmauld Place over the Christmas holidays had given him a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in a long time, but Ron's letter had made him want to go visit for a couple of days. "What's the problem with that? The Flu Network's open, or I can take you on the motorbike." Sirius answered without hesitation. "No need for the motorbike," Harry said quickly, remembering last year's Humping Willow incident, branches whipping and thrashing at the first thought of a flying motorbike. He declined Sirius's offer. "The fireplace will be fine." In Hogsmeade, after changing out of his travel clothes in the valley, Eno returned to his small house. On the desk of the second-floor room, a letter lay open. "Fied. Take this to the library. Give it to Lena," Eno called softly. The letter was for Lena. By his reckoning, she had been in the Hogwarts library for nearly 2 months and must have found her way into the restricted section. He wanted her help locating books on Fiendfire. After his conversation with Prometheus, he had become truly curious about that devouring, growing flame. Fiendfire's nature was strangely compelling. It burned indiscriminately, friend and foe alike, and could mimic the shapes of magical creatures. The possibilities it suggested made his imagination race. Once the letter was sent, Eno leaned back in his chair. This trip to the Greek myths had raised more questions than it answered. Not only the flame, but the sudden appearance of the valley in his sanctuary. He still understood only part of what had happened. The valley had not just overturned his assumptions, it hinted at other possibilities. If he could bring a valley back like this from a tale in Mount Hymettus, then perhaps other stories could yield the same rewards. If the tall tower in the forest or the 12 coffins from the Grimm brothers' tales could be retrieved in the same way, maybe those 2 magic books on resurrection and time wouldn't have to stay shelved forever. Chapter 216, The Black House and the Fourth Horcrux. Time passed like water. Christmas of their 3rd year arrived as scheduled. On the second morning of the break, after the whole Greek story mess, Eno was woken by a steady tapping. When he opened his eyes, the second-floor window was already crowded with owls. Snowy owls, horned owls, eagle owls, nearly a dozen different kinds. Among them was his own little horned owl, the one he'd bought from the owl post and let Hermione borrow for £50. The bird puffed up proudly as if to say, "You deliver the mail. I'm going home." The gesture, however, earned it nothing but exclusion from the other birds, especially Hedwig, who gave the little owl a brusque nudge with her head. Watching the messengers outside the window, Eno flicked his wand and had the second-floor window open itself. With a chorus of hoots, the owls flew in, dropped their packages onto the table, and then slipped back out one by one. He hadn't even picked up the scattered parcels when a soft touch at his finger made him look down. The little horned owl, small but striking, stared up at him with huge, unblinking eyes. Eno melted on the spot. "Wait here," he told it. "I'll get you something to eat. Hermione nearly turned you into a fluff ball, and you're still hungry all day. Candy, ham, cheese, nuts." He emptied a suitcase's worth of treats onto the table. While the little owl tucked into the buffet, Eno began opening his own gifts. Times had changed. Once people learned the Hogsmeade address, nobody sent presents to Hogwarts anymore. A Draco commemorative golden snitch, a Weasley-embroidered sweater, he read as he unwrapped, a hovering quill dutifully recording each item on parchment. It was probably his nature. He hated feeling indebted, so he meticulously tallied everything, planning a return gift for each sender according to value. Owls were sometimes late, but with feet around, he wasn't worried. Once bought, the return presents could be dispatched in under 15 minutes. He finished classifying the gifts, rolled up the inventory, and went downstairs. The shops at Zonko's and Honeyduke's were quiet in the morning. He planned to buy all the return gifts at once and make time to visit the Black House. Some matters had to be settled sooner or later. Number 12. Grimmauld Place. Green flames leapt from the living room fireplace, and Sirius rose from the hearth as the flue powder died down. From the last letter, he knew exactly who was coming. He still owed everything to this person for leading him to Peter and clearing his name. As the green smoke cleared and Eno stepped out, Sirius found himself face to face with the young man. The change in him was striking. In half a year, he'd gone from gaunt and hollow-eyed to healthy and rosy. "Welcome, Eno. May I call you that?" Sirius said, extending his hand. "I meant to meet you when I caught Peter, but back then I was still a convict." "Of course, Mr. Black." Eno smiled. "Call me Sirius. Harry talks about you a lot. Honestly, you remind me of a young Dumbledore." Sirius spoke quickly, as if he had a lot to say, and Eno let him talk without interruption. "Oh," Sirius slapped his forehead. "Creature, bring tea and something to eat." He regretted the command the instant it left his mouth. The lad before him had come from a Muggle orphanage. Given Creature's temperament, Sirius expected an insult. It was too late. The house elf appeared in the room, and to Sirius's astonishment, bowed deeply to Eno. "Noble guest, of noble and pure blood, your arrival graces the House of Black." Unlike Sirius's incredulous expression, Eno regarded Creature with calm interest. It wasn't the flattery that caught him so much as the faint, peculiar scent he recognized. The trace of a Horcrux clung to the elf. Prolonged contact with the Slytherin locket had affected him. Perhaps Creature's erratic behavior in the original story had a reason after all. After the bow, Creature vanished and returned with two very different tea services. On Eno's side, there were delicately wrapped sweets and piping hot black tea. On Sirius's, a half glass of plain water and a partly bitten biscuit. The obvious favoritism made the usually blithe Sirius feel suddenly awkward. He felt like the uninvited guest. "But there's something I think you should know," Eno said, cutting into the awkward silence. He told Sirius the full story of Regulus Black without hiding anything, then stated his purpose plainly. "So I need to take the object the Dark Lord left behind and destroy it." Hearing Regulus's name moved Sirius deeply. His eyes reddened and his voice trembled. Eno waited in respectful silence, giving the man time to process. The large living room fell quiet. After a long moment, Sirius spoke in a hoarse voice. "I'm grateful for what you've done, but I want Professor Dumbledore to know about this. It's not distrust." "Then write the letter now." Eno cut him off coldly. The divisions between houses ran deep. He had no doubt that if he'd been a Gryffindor, Sirius wouldn't be so hesitant. Sirius looked torn. Before he could answer, Eno waved a hand and ordered the heir. "Fide, go fetch him." Fide answered at once, and in the cramped, cluttered House of Black, a new plan was already being set in motion. Number 12, Grimmauld Place. The air in the old Black family house felt stubbornly awkward. Sirius shifted from foot to foot, uncomfortable and regretting his earlier outburst. Now that he'd cooled down, he realized he could have quietly told Dumbledore everything. "It's all Creature's fault," he grumbled inwardly, blaming his own proud, pure-blood temper for making him flare up. Eno, by contrast, was much calmer. He'd been irritated at first, but the anger had passed quickly. A foolish man wasn't worth more than a shrug. If Sirius had been cleverer, maybe the Potters would not have died so easily. No use clinging to that now. Silence stretched on, slow and awkward. At the same time, in the headmaster's office at Hogwarts, a blue stream of light twinkled and Feed landed on the desk. Across from him, Fawkes, the familiar red phoenix, gave no sign of hostility. He chirped softly and, as if eager, helped himself to the herbs on a nearby shelf before perching beside Feed. Fide, however, remained strangely restrained, standing quietly and careful to honor a request he remembered from Eno. "Do not appear before ordinary wizards. Do not chirp carelessly." The two phoenixes, blue and red, made a pleasing pair until someone else entered the room. "Long time no see, Fide," Dumbledore said with his usual easy smile as he crossed to the desk and took the letter. It was short. Eno had been concise to save time. When Dumbledore folded the envelope, the smile slipped away and solemnity settled over his face. "Feed, take me to Eno." Fide nodded. In the 6 months since he had hatched, his confusion had melted into a steadier clarity. He could understand more now. A blue flash, and Dumbledore appeared at Grimmauld Place. "Professor Dumbledore!" Sirius, suddenly regaining his composure, stepped forward to greet him. Dumbledore's single glance at the room and the letter was all he needed to guess the situation. "Thank you for your trust, Sirius," he said kindly, then added, "You might try to trust Eno as well. I trust him very much." Eno chuckled. "Professor, I'm more in agreement with Mr. Black's approach. It never hurts to be cautious." The formal Mr. Black made Sirius avert his eyes, embarrassed. He then told Dumbledore the whole story in as few words as he could. As he spoke, Dumbledore grew more grave. He thought of a brave, good person who'd lost his way and, upon seeing his mistake, chosen to sacrifice himself to spare others. The weight of it showed on the old headmaster's face. A few minutes later, Dumbledore sighed softly. Tom's talent was unparalleled, but he never learned restraint. Before we deal with those relics, we must bring back the one who resisted in secret. Eno felt a small, private nod of approval. Dumbledore's authority wasn't only in power. His wisdom, his kindness, his understanding of human nature let him see what mattered. Voldemort's relics were important, but Dumbledore chose to honor Regulus first. It was a decision that contained no flaw: respect for the dead, dignity for the living. "Professor," Sirius choked, finding it hard to speak. "I know," Dumbledore answered quietly. "Let a hero see the light again. If not, what would make us any different from Lord Voldemort?" Sirius was visibly moved. Creature, the house elf at the center of the locket affair, shuffled into the room as if he had been waiting for the summons. He paid little heed to Sirius at first. Instead, he bowed low to Eno, then bobbed respectfully to Dumbledore. "Old Creature knows," he chattered. Creature knew the young master was in the lake, but Creature could not. There were too many. Creature is useless, could not bring him back. As he spoke, Creature struck his fists against his own head in a frenzy, tearing at his rags in a fit of shame. The movement revealed long-hidden scars beneath the elf's clothing. Countless scratches and bite marks, some old and faded, others looking fresh. The wounds were too extensive, too deliberately inflicted, to be self-inflicted by Creature alone. "Stop, Creature!" Sirius ordered, though his voice was calm and threaded with sympathy. "Now, take me to Regulus." House elves can apparate in ways far more precise and effortless than wizards. With Creature leading, the old black house grew quiet as the trio vanished. Eno turned to Dumbledore. "Thank you for your trust, Professor." He meant it. Dumbledore had not asked for explanations, and the refusal to pry felt like an almost blind faith. Eno smiled to himself at the thought. If Dumbledore had a surname, perhaps it fit him well. The grateful trust made something warm stir in him. A soft bang, and Creature was back in the living room. Then, after a dizzying sensation, Eno opened his eyes to a wide, echoing cavern. The taste of salt and the distant roll of waves filled the air. Dumbledore stood nearby, brought here as well. Creature walked straight to a rock wall, and with trembling excitement, pulled a rusty dinner knife from a crack. "It's here!" he cried. Without warning, Creature plunged the blade into his wrist. A bright streak of red ran down, but before the knife could be used further, someone snapped a spell. "Expelliarmus!" Eno held the rusty knife in his hand and stared. The metal was black with dried blood, congealed, old stains. Seeing the hidden scars earlier had already shaken his opinion of the elf. Watching Creature's ritualized self-harm made it worse. The way Creature had tried this, over and over, alone, across the years, was a knowledge that pressed on Eno like a cold hand. Chapter 2 and 18, The Inferi at the Bottom of the Lake and Feeds Hobbies. "Blood is required. Only a sacrifice will open this door," Creature shrieked, clutching at a dinner knife with trembling fingers. "Noble master, let old Creature do it. Old Creature has plenty of blood." "Quiet. I'll think of something," Eno said quietly. Of the three people present, even ignoring Sirius, having Dumbledore and him stand by while a house elf bled to open a door would have been beneath them both. Creature's hand loosened on the knife at the rebuke, and a small wash of relief crossed Dumbledore's face as he stepped forward to examine the rock face. "A low-level trick," Dumbledore murmured, studying the pattern. "It requires the opener to weaken themselves." Tom once again misunderstood the nature of his own magic. Eno called instead into the dimness. "Fide, bring me my oil lamp." Exploring with a lamp was something he knew well. Ignoring Dumbledore's curious look, Eno drew the lamp forward and held it up to the stone. Under the lamp's light, a simple pattern resolved itself. Not anything mystical, but a basic alchemical exchange rune. Anyone schooled in alchemy would recognize it, a small ritual designed to accept a life force input and return access. Normally, it demanded blood saturated with magic, and Lord Voldemort could be cruelly literal. Under steady light, though, the trick was obvious. Alter one or two runes, change the offered substance, and the mechanism would accept something else. Aguamenti, Eno called. A column of water sprang from his wand and ran over the runes. Where the pattern met the jet of water, a white flash ran along the seam, and the great slab of rock split as cleanly as a book, forming an arched entrance. "It's open. Master Regulus is inside, but there are so many of them," Creature stammered, and then bolted through the gap with Sirius close behind. They led the way into the hidden chamber. The cave beyond revealed itself reluctantly. For a moment, under the lamp's weak light, they could only make out the suggestion of space. Then, with a clearer illumination, the cavern showed a vast, still lake stretching away into gloom. "Heavy dark arts," Dumbledore said, studying the calm surface. Eno stepped forward and flicked his wand. "Incendio!" Orange-red flames leapt, fanned, and billowed into a cloud that broke apart into hundreds of candle-like flames. They hovered like starlight over the lake. Each tiny light hung and motionless, bathing the cavern in soft, steady brightness. Dumbledore watched the floating flames and smiled. "Excellent transfiguration. If Minerva saw that, you'd earn extra credit." He looked, for a long moment, at the sky of flames and found it hard to believe that in 3 short years, this formerly reserved student from the astronomy tower had learned transfiguration so well. At the bottom of the lake, 1,000 eyes opened all at once. Corpses lay packed across the muddy floor, mostly Muggle clothing, though 1 or 2 bore signs of wizarding life. There, a Slytherin robe draped over a corpse. "Master Regulus is down there, at the bottom of the lake," Creature said in a voice that finally stopped breaking, the gray of his face gone completely. Tears welled in the house elf's large eyes. Sirius saw Regulus's robes and felt his chest tighten as if gripped by ice. The boy who had followed him around, the younger brother who'd been so obedient and eager to please, now lay forever still in the cold. The sight of that half-faded Slytherin robe hit him like a hammer. Regulus had not even finished his schooling. He could scarcely breathe. "I'm taking him back," he said hoarsely, wiping his face. "He can't stay down there. He's coming home." In Fairy, the reanimated corpses of the dark arts have no minds, souls, or wills of their own. They are puppets, given motion and obedience by malevolent magic. Easy to make and limited in cunning, they nonetheless terrify in huge numbers. Yet the horde in the lake behaved oddly. Rather than surging, they shrank back into caves and behind boulders, crawling away from the light as if it burned. Inferi are instinctively repelled by fire and light. These candle lights above the water were like beacons of hope. Under their suppression, the situation became manageable. Sirius plunged into the lake and swam for the Slytherin robe without hesitation. Dumbledore stayed close by. Nothing unexpected could happen with him present, so Eno didn't worry. Instead, his attention shifted to Fide. He felt the bird's bright emotion like a warm note in his mind, a joy that vibrated and grew as he watched the faint blue glow beat on the opposite shore. Without delay, he shifted into his animagus form. As a black swan, he pushed off the water, gained speed, and flew across the cavern. On a rock above the far bank, Fide had his head bent, drinking greedily from a cloudy pool in a depression in the stone. Eno's face twisted with a strange mixture of amusement and disbelief. He had always thought Fide didn't need to eat or drink. Apparently, the phoenix simply disliked ordinary food. He knew that particular liquid. It was a potion brewed by Lord Voldemort himself, a venomous, hallucinogenic draught that had driven even Dumbledore to long and painful visions. As Fide drank, Eno felt the bird's pleasure grow clear as daylight. The phoenix did not recoil from poison, it delighted in it. The more toxic the brew, the more exultant Fide seemed. In a few minutes, the rock bowl was nearly dry and the phoenix had drunk his fill. Fide finally rose and flew out of the cave. Even here, Eno thought, the chamber had been warded. Voldemort's protections forbade apparition and seemed to bar other forms of magical travel as well. Yet the phoenix took to the air anyway, small wings beating, bright and calm. On the rock beside the empty puddle lay a folded scrap of paper. Eno picked it up and read aloud. "By the time you read this, I will be long dead. but I want you to know that I discovered your secret and intend to destroy it as soon as possible." The note had been buried for more than 10 years, and its naive, defiant tone made Ino ache with a warm, helpless sadness. The boy who had stood here, 17, maybe 18, had been unafraid of death in a way that was almost foolish. Regulus had given his life to teach the Dark Lord a lesson. For a moment, Ino found himself thinking, half to himself and half as a quiet reprimand, "You should have been in Gryffindor more than Sirius." Ino folded the note carefully. He intended to see Regulus's story told properly. The Daily Prophet had run one-sided reports before, but those columns had still made Regulus's name known. Allied with Dumbledore, he believed they could make sure the truth reached every corner of the wizarding world. After a decade in office, Cornelius Fudge would understand the rules of politics well enough. Don't pick a fight with the young, pick on the old. Ino smiled faintly at the thought and slipped the letter into his robe, resolve settling like steel inside him. Chapter 219, Fortune-Telling and Fortune-Tellers, 12 Grimmauld Place. Regulus's remains had been placed temporarily in the garden behind the old house. Sirius had arranged the funeral for the next day. He had sent letters to as many people as he could think of, Remus, the Weasleys, Regulus's cousins, perhaps to make sure his brother wouldn't be completely alone. In the sitting room of the Black family home, Ino and Dumbledore sat opposite one another, an ornate locket box set between them. It was about the size of an egg, the front cut into a large hollowed S and studded with many green stones that shimmered faintly in the lamplight. "This is it," Creature croaked, his voice still harsh but oddly subdued. "Young Master Regulus ordered me to destroy it by any means necessary." "Professor, what will you do?" Ino asked, eyes fixed on the locket. Even without a lamp burning nearby, he could feel the malicious weight it carried. Dumbledore said nothing at first. He tapped the locket gently with his elder wand, as if testing its nature. After a moment, he breathed out and smiled faintly. "You handle it." "You want me to handle it?" Ino blinked. "What, don't tell me you had no plan?" Dumbledore chuckled. "If Sirius hadn't interfered at the last moment, you might already have done it yourself. What business would that leave me?" "All right, give me a minute." Ino shrugged, lifted his wand, plucked the locket from the table, and vanished. He was gone less than 10 seconds. When he returned, he tossed the locket back toward Dumbledore. "Done, but I'd like to give this to Professor Snape. It's a Slytherin relic. By rights, it belongs with the Slytherin head of house." His tone softened as he added, "I don't think it should be opened here and now. I'd rather study it properly after the Christmas holidays." Dumbledore regarded the locket, which now seemed somehow purified. A pleased smile touched his face. "I told you to handle it." "You trust me so much you don't even ask how I managed it?" Ino asked, a little bewildered. "Why ask?" Dumbledore retorted lightly, leaning back. "Is a good outcome not enough?" He grew serious then and told Ino something he rarely spoke of. "A friend of mine once remarked that divination and prophecy are powers of a different order. They're immense, almost beyond ordinary magic." He went on to explain what he meant, and Ino listened. Dumbledore described divination as having 2 levels. There are those with real talent, true seers, whose pronouncements can shape events simply by being spoken, and there are those without such gift, whose guesses are mostly empty noise. He likened an ordinary person predicting tomorrow's London stock market to shouting into the wind. What they say has no effect. But if someone like Warren Buffett were to make a prediction, his words would already be part of the market's movement the moment he spoke. The reputation and influence of the speaker become part of the outcome. That, Dumbledore said, is the terrible power gifted diviners can possess, to influence the world simply by speaking of it. The most capable seers in the wizarding world can wield that power almost at will, which explains why so many of them are held in awe. But the gift exacts a price. Diviners who do not learn restraint or who talk too freely can alter events recklessly. The moment a prophecy is uttered, its price is paid. About 15 minutes later, Dumbledore stopped, and Ino sat quietly, taking it all in. It made sense of much. Perhaps Dumbledore had known of Peter Pettigrew's betrayal and of the existence of Horcruxes because of this kind of far-reaching knowledge. The old headmaster's insistence and his careful, sometimes secretive behavior looked less like paranoia than the protective caution of a man who had seen what whispered words could do. "I understand," Eno said earnestly. "Thank you, Professor." Dumbledore nodded. Too many talented diviners recognized the danger only when it was too late. Their endings were not kind. Eno thought of Professor Trelawney, the eccentric seer whose life in the original story had been less than fortunate. "What about Professor Trelawney?" he asked. "Sybil?" Dumbledore's voice grew softer. "I told her, and I promised she would not have to keep doing formal divinations at Hogwarts." He hesitated then, and the hesitation carried weight. "I brought her to Hogwarts to protect her," he said at last. Later, Hogsmeade at dusk lay quiet and soft. Eno sat leaning back in his small cottage, the day's conversation still revolving in his mind. He had returned home after his visit to the Black House. With the funeral tomorrow, there was no reason to remain. The little locket sat on his table, but studying it felt wrong for now. Dumbledore's words had been like a hand lifting a dusty curtain. Suddenly, the faint outlines of fate and fortune seemed to overlay every story, every choice. Shoudy's share for today. Pixie British Ministry of Magic Classification, XXX. Origin and distribution. Pixies are small magical creatures found mainly in Cornwall, England. Appearance. Pixies are entirely iron blue and grow up to about 8 inches tall. They have no wings but are capable of flight. Habits. Pixies are viviparous and naturally mischievous. They love pranks, grabbing an unsuspecting person's ears, lifting them up, and dropping them onto treetops or rooftops is typical behavior. Chapter 2 and 20. Planting Flowers and the Burrow. When dawn broke the next morning, Eno opened his eyes quietly. He had fallen asleep in the small hours after spending the night lost in thoughts of divination and prophecy. Tired as he was, he reminded himself of the day's arrangements and forced himself out of bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. After a quick wash, he went downstairs to make breakfast. This was when the advantage of combining domestic charms with living in Hogsmeade became obvious. Household magic made the cooking effortless, and being in Hogsmeade meant he could use magic openly. Flour arcs through the air like white ribbons before dropping into a bowl to be stirred. Fruits and vegetables floated obediently to the sink, took their bath, then hopped, one by one, onto the cutting board. As Eno waved his wand to finish the meal, he also planned to find time to deal with the trace on his wand. It wasn't that he hadn't wanted to, he simply hadn't known how. Now, with the lamp's detection capabilities and his growing knowledge of alchemy, he felt equipped to handle it. Half an hour later, a simple meal was laid out. Fresh-baked bread, 2 fried eggs, and a vegetable salad floated gently to the table. From the window, he watched the alley beyond. What had once been a quiet, lifeless lane now showed more signs of life. The alley walls were still draped in ferns, but it felt less desolate. Neighboring houses were gradually being reoccupied. He watched wisps of smoke rising from chimneys and allowed himself a small laugh. Wizards and muggles weren't so different after all. Both liked gathering and a bit of bustle. When he'd bought the house a year ago, it had been utterly empty. Now, several nearly abandoned homes had been brought back into use. After breakfast, he went back upstairs. Regulus's funeral was set for 3 in the afternoon, and he couldn't afford to waste the 6 or 7 hours until then. On the second floor, he gathered several clay pots and then vanished from the room. Shelter Valley, whatever its inner workings, had the odd property of keeping its weather in step with the outside world. Unlike the unchanging chill of the icy path he'd traversed before, this valley's day and night cycles, sun and clouds, shifted with the weather beyond its borders. That simple synchronization gave the whole place life. Sun, soil, and rain were all it took to lift everything out of monotone. In the valley, Eno knelt and used a small hoe he'd transfigured to dig into the soft earth. Now that he knew the valley's weather would accommodate cultivation, the first thing to do was transplant the precious magical plants he'd been keeping in pots, the 3 magic beans from the Grimm brothers and the berry bush from Narnia. The beans carried the kind of mythic weight you'd expect from a fairy tale. The Narnian berries had been unusually strange from the start. Seeds brought back from Narnia had behaved unlike anything he'd seen, neglected all summer, and then suddenly coming back to life with a little water or sprouting an impossible vibrant green that made the hair on his arms stand up. Now you're under the same sky again. I hope you won't fight anymore, he murmured as he looked at the potted plants. Of the two Narnian seeds, one had become an ice-blue camellia and the other a dense, exuberant bush. He had a vague understanding of why the two plants were so different. Since leaving Narnia and reading the original storybook he'd bought, details that had once slipped past him now made sense. From the talking rabbit to the robin's song, the bewildered wood sprites, and even Santa Claus's last words, "Someone has already prepared a gift for you," a pattern emerged. If he tried to make sense of it, it seemed Aslan might have rewarded him for something. Throughout his time in Narnia, even when compelled to stand with the White Witch, he had never acted out of line. He hadn't harmed a single creature. Perhaps, in his small way, he had fit Narnia's requirements, kindness and age, and had been granted a gift by the Great Lion. The memory remained faint, but it did not stop his work. He dug 4 one-foot square holes not far from the small marble building and carefully broke the clay pots, burying them along with the original soil. The Narnian bush settled into the earth and went quiet. The Grimbeans, however, seemed to sense the change of environment immediately. Seedlings that had been only a few inches tall shot up as if fed a sudden growth charm. In seconds, each plant became a young oak over 2 meters tall, branches and leaves unfurling luxuriantly. Eno chuckled and shook his head. Very grim brothers indeed. Seeds in a fairy tale needed only one night to become towering trees. After transplanting and watering, he returned to the house feeling the weight of one worry lifted. He had always been anxious about those particular plants, especially the 3 beans that now stood as oaks. Blessed, apparently, by some harvest goddess, they were meant to bear gifts every harvest festival. What those gifts might be, even the Grimm brothers might not have known. It was the unknown that made it exciting. Now that they were safely planted in the valley, his concerns faded. He simply had to wait patiently until next September's harvest festival. A little later, he headed downstairs. He had time in the morning to visit the tailor and order 2 suits. He couldn't attend a funeral in his blue robes. As he stepped out the door, the scene shifted miles away to a crooked, magically repaired house outside Devon, where the Weasleys sat around their kitchen table with a heavy hush about them. Half an hour before breakfast, they had received a letter from Sirius. Regulus's funeral. The letter also told of a hero who'd quietly sacrificed himself more than 10 years ago in the fight against the Dark Lord. It's hard to imagine. He was only in his 7th year, barely half a month from becoming an adult, Mrs. Weasley said, dabbing at her eyes. Reading the letter had made her sad. Regulus's story reminded her painfully of her 2 brothers, Fabian and Gideon Prewett. "It's in the past now, love. Everything will be all right," Arthur soothed, Therese taking his wife's hand. Harry and the others sat at the table in silence, listening to the grown-ups' voices. He hesitated, unsure whether to tell anyone about the strange dream he had, an absurd, disturbing vision in which he'd seen the Dark Lord.